The night that was never supposed to end. Stockton, California was unusually calm that night. It was the last weekend of November 2025. Winter had not fully arrived yet, but the air carried a cold sharpness that made people pull their jackets closer. On Lucille Avenue, a modest banquet hall glowed brightly against the darkness. Strings of colorful lights hung outside, balloons bobbed gently near the entrance, and cars lined the street in messy rows. Inside, the hall was alive. It was a child's birthday party, the kind of gathering meant to feel safe, joyful, and ordinary. More than 100 people were present. Parents, grandparents, cousins, neighbors, and dozens of children. The music was loud but cheerful. A DJ stood near the corner, switching between pop songs and kids' favorites. Laughter bounced off the walls. Phones were raised everywhere, recording small moments that parents believed they would watch years later. No one sensed danger. Children ran across the polished floor, chasing each other between tables stacked with food. A cake sat near the center of the room, untouched, waiting for candles to be lit. Mothers adjusted party hats on their children's heads. Fathers stood near the walls, talking casually, checking the time, thinking about work the next morning. Outside, the street looked ordinary. Around 10 p.m., a dark-colored vehicle slowly pulled up near the banquet hall. No one noticed. In Stockton, late-night traffic was common. A few minutes later, another vehicle stopped nearby. Again, no one paid attention. There were no raised voices, no arguments, no signs of trouble. Then, without warning, everything changed. The first gunshot sounded like a firecracker. Some people laughed at first, thinking it was part of the music or a joke, but the second and third shots came too fast, too sharp. Panic exploded through the room. Screams replaced laughter. Children froze, confused, unable to understand what was happening. Gunfire ripped through the hall. Witnesses later said the shots seemed to come from outside, then inside, as if the attackers knew exactly where to aim. Glass shattered. Tables flipped over. People dropped to the floor, shielding children with their bodies. Others ran blindly toward exits, pushing, falling, screaming names. Within seconds, the birthday party turned into chaos. A young boy fell near the dance floor. A girl collapsed beside her mother. A man tried to pull children toward the kitchen area before he was hit. Blood spread across the floor where cake crumbs had been moments earlier. The shooting lasted less than a minute. Then silence. The attackers were gone. Outside, witnesses reported seeing vehicles speeding away into the night. No faces were clearly seen, no voices identified, just headlights disappearing into darkness. Inside the hall, the aftermath was unbearable. Parents screamed their children's names. Some held lifeless bodies, begging them to wake up. Others pressed their hands against wounds, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Phones that once recorded joy now dialed 911 in shaking hands. Police arrived within minutes. So did ambulances. Red and blue lights flooded Lucille Avenue. Officers rushed inside, weapons drawn, unsure if the shooters were still nearby. Paramedics moved quickly, stepping over broken glass and overturned chairs. 4 people were pronounced dead. 3 of them were children. More than a dozen others were injured, some critically. By midnight, the banquet hall was sealed off with yellow tape. What had been a place of celebration was now a crime scene. Bullet casings littered the floor. The cake remained untouched, candles never lit. News spread across Stockton, then California, then the entire country. How could this happen at a child's birthday party? The question echoed everywhere on television, online, in police briefings, and in the hearts of grieving families. Investigators worked through the night. They collected shell casings, reviewed surveillance footage, and interviewed terrified witnesses. Early evidence suggested multiple shooters and multiple firearms, but motives were unclear, targets were unknown. By morning, one terrifying truth was already clear. No suspects had been arrested. No names had been released, and the people responsible had vanished without a trace. What happened next would turn this tragedy into one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes, a case filled with silence, fear, and unanswered questions. And this was only the beginning.
The investigation begins. By sunrise, Stockton no longer felt like the same city. Yellow police tape stretched across Lucille Avenue, blocking traffic and drawing crowds of stunned residents. News vans lined the street. Reporters spoke in low, serious voices, careful with every word. Behind them stood families who hadn't slept, their faces hollow, eyes red, clinging to each other for support. Inside the banquet hall, detectives moved slowly. Every step mattered. The floor was still marked with numbered evidence tags. Bullet casings lay scattered in unnatural patterns, each one telling a silent story about where the shooters stood and how they moved. Broken glass crunched under boots. Bloodstains darkened the polished floor, already beginning to dry. Crime scene technicians photographed everything. Walls, doors, tables, chairs, even the balloons. Some still floating near the ceiling, untouched by the violence below. The birthday cake sat exactly where it had been left, its smooth white frosting cracked by vibrations from gunfire. Detective Marcus Hawley stood near the center of the room, staring at the scene. He had worked homicides for nearly 15 years. Gang shootings, domestic disputes, drug deals gone wrong. But this was different. Children were never supposed to be part of the equation. Multiple calibers. One of the forensic analysts said quietly, crouching near a cluster of shell casings. At least 2 shooters. Maybe 3. That matched the early witness statements. Survivors described shots coming from different directions. Some said they saw flashes near the entrance. Others swore bullets came from the side windows. The chaos made memories unreliable, but one thing was consistent. This attack was fast, coordinated, and intentional. Outside, officers canvassed the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they'd heard or seen anything unusual. Most had heard gunshots. Some saw cars speeding away, but descriptions were vague. Dark vehicles, tinted windows, headlights off. No license plates. No faces. Security footage from nearby businesses was collected. Grainy clips showed 2 vehicles arriving shortly before the shooting and leaving moments later. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the occupants, but it confirmed what police feared. The shooters had planned their escape. At the hospital, the situation was just as grim. Doctors worked through the night to save the injured. Some victims were children hit by stray bullets. Others were adults who had thrown themselves in front of kids, absorbing the impact. Families crowded waiting rooms, praying for updates that came too slowly or not at all. By midday, The police held their first press conference. The sheriff stood behind a podium, his voice steady but heavy. "This was a targeted act of violence," he said. "We believe the shooters knew the event was happening. We're actively investigating multiple leads." Questions came fast. Was this gang-related? Do you have suspects? Why a children's party? The sheriff answered carefully. "We don't know the motive yet, and no arrests have been made." That sentence echoed louder than any gunshot. No arrests. As hours turned into days, the city demanded answers. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses. Stories conflicted. Trauma distorted timelines. Some people were afraid to talk. Others wanted to help but remembered only fragment shadows, movement, noise. One witness mentioned seeing a man standing near the entrance shortly before the shooting, wearing a hooded jacket. Another described someone arguing outside earlier in the evening. None of it was solid enough to act on. Then came the rumors. Social media exploded with speculation. Names were thrown around without evidence. Old feuds were dragged back into the light. Innocent people were accused. Police urged the public not to spread misinformation, but fear spreads faster than truth. Meanwhile, the families of the victims prepared for funerals. Tiny coffins lined church aisles. Photos of smiling children sat beside flowers. Parents stood frozen, unable to accept that their lives had shattered in a single minute. Detective Halle attended one of the services quietly, standing in the back. He made himself a promise that day. "We will not let this fade," he whispered. But as weeks passed, cracks began to show. Leads dried up. Tips came in, but most led nowhere. Surveillance footage hit its limits. Witnesses stopped answering calls. The suspects remained ghosts. The case file grew thicker, but the truth stayed just out of reach. And slowly, painfully, investigators realized something terrifying. The shooters hadn't just escaped that night. They had vanished into silence. And the longer that silence lasted, the harder it would be to break. Theories, silence, and the suspects that vanished. By the third week after the shooting, the investigation had entered its most dangerous phase. Not chaos, not grief, but silence. The initial shock had faded. News trucks left Lucille Avenue. National headlines moved on to the next tragedy. But inside the Stockton Police Department, the case refused to rest. It sat heavy on every desk, every briefing room screen, every detective's mind. Detective Marcus Halle knew this stage well. This was when cases either broke open or slowly died. The first theory. A targeted hit from the beginning. Investigators believed the shooting wasn't random. The volume of fire, the speed, the coordinated escape. This wasn't panic. It was execution. The leading theory suggested that one adult at the party was the intended target, and everyone else became collateral damage. Detectives combed through guest lists, background checks, old disputes. They examined criminal histories, past arrests, gang affiliations. Several names surfaced. Men with past connections to street groups, old enemies. People who had survived earlier violence, but every trail ended the same way. No evidence tying them to that night. No threats beforehand. No messages. No confirmed motive. And none of the suspects were present at the scene when the shooting began. The second theory. Gang retaliation. Stockton had struggled with gang violence for years, so the question came naturally. Was this retaliation? Ballistics confirmed something disturbing. Multiple weapons were used, possibly from different calibers, that aligned with gang-style attacks. But there were problems with the theory. Gang shootings usually sent messages. Spray-painted warnings, social media posts, street talk. This case had none of that. No group claimed responsibility. No rumors spread on the streets. No intercepted communications. Informants, people who usually talked, suddenly went quiet. Too quiet. Detectives began to suspect fear was at work. Not just fear of the police, but fear of whoever had carried out the attack. The vehicles. 1 month after the shooting, police released surveillance images to the public. 2 vehicles. Blurry, dark-colored, ordinary. They could have belonged to anyone. "Someone knows these cars," the sheriff said. "We need the public's help." Tips flooded in at first. thousands of them. Most were useless. Looks like my neighbor's car. I saw something similar last year. My cousin owns one like that. None led to arrests. No plates. No registered owners tied to the crime. No clear path. It was as if the vehicles themselves had vanished after that night. Witnesses who stopped talking, perhaps the most disturbing shift, came with the witnesses. In the beginning, people were eager to help. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. But weeks later, phones went unanswered. People who had agreed to interviews suddenly declined. Some changed their stories. Others moved away entirely. One key witness, a man who claimed he saw one of the shooters, stopped returning calls after receiving what he described as a warning. Police could never confirm it, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want this case solved. The anonymous tip. Then, just when the investigation felt frozen, a tip came in. Anonymous. Short. Carefully worded. It claimed the shooters weren't from Stockton at all. That they came from outside the city, hired to carry out the attack, paid in cash, and disappeared immediately after. A contract. A hit. Detectives tried to verify it. They traced phone records, looked for unusual travel patterns, searched motel records and rental cars. Nothing. The tip couldn't be confirmed or dismissed. It sat in the file, highlighted in yellow. Pressure from above. As months passed, pressure mounted. Families demanded progress. Community leaders organized vigils that turned into protests. Justice for the children signs appeared across the city. Internally, the department faced scrutiny. Why no arrests? Why no suspect's name? Was the case being mishandled? Detective Halle felt the weight of it all. Every night, he replayed the scene in his head. The shell casings. The angles. The timing. He became obsessed with one detail. The shooters knew exactly when to strike when the room was full, when exits were crowded, when panic would be unavoidable. That level of planning meant intelligence. Someone had shared information. Someone close. The most terrifying possibility. By the end of the third month, investigators were forced to confront a chilling idea. What if the people responsible were never meant to be found? No digital trail. No witnesses willing to talk. No mistakes. Just silence. And silence, Detective Halle knew, could be deadlier than bullets. Because silence meant fear had won. And if fear had won once, it could win again. Missed chances and the weight of time. Time is the quiet enemy of every unsolved case. Detective Marcus Halle knew that better than most. With every passing day, memories faded, evidence degraded, and fear grew stronger than truth. By the fourth month after the Stockton shooting, the investigation was no longer racing. It was struggling to breathe. The case hadn't gone cold, but it was cooling. The evidence that couldn't speak. Ballistics had already told their story. At least 2 firearms, possibly 3, all semi-automatic. None recovered. The shell casings linked the weapons to no known crimes in national databases. That meant one of 2 things. The guns were new, or they had been carefully kept out of circulation. Both possibilities were terrifying. DNA results offered little hope. The crime scene was crowded, chaotic, and contaminated by hundreds of people fleeing for their lives. Touch DNA was everywhere. Nothing reliable. No clear profile to build from. Cameras had failed too. The banquet hall's security system had gone offline earlier that week. Nearby street cameras captured only fragments of vehicles entering and leaving the area. Their movements precise, but faces hidden. The shooters knew where cameras were. They avoided light. They avoided exposure. They planned this. The tip that came too late then came the moment that still haunted Halle. Nearly 5 months after the shooting, a woman contacted police. She sounded nervous, hesitant. She said she had seen something that night, something she didn't understand at the time. She described 2 men standing near the side of the building, checking their phones repeatedly, watching the entrance. One of them wore gloves, even though it wasn't that cold. She remembered thinking it was strange. She hadn't come forward earlier because she was afraid. By the time detectives followed up, the trail was dead. Phone records from that night had already aged beyond quick recovery. Cell tower data provided only wide, useless zones. The men she described matched no known individuals. If she had spoken earlier, things might have been different. Or maybe not. Not that uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Pressure behind closed doors inside the department. Tension grew. Supervisors asked for progress reports. City officials wanted reassurance. Resources were slowly reallocated to newer cases, with fresher evidence. Solvable cases. No one said the words out loud, but everyone felt them. How long can we keep chasing ghosts? Detective Halle argued fiercely to keep the case active. He reminded his superiors of the victims, of the children, of the promise made to families standing beside tiny graves. They listened, but time doesn't listen to anyone. The families left behind for the families. Life had split into two parts, before and after. Birthdays passed without candles. Bedrooms stayed untouched. Parents replayed that night endlessly, searching for meaning in a moment that made none. They met monthly with investigators, clinging to hope in small updates that often meant nothing. We're still working leads. The case is open. We haven't forgotten. But hope, like time, wears down. Some families stopped attending meetings. Others became louder, angrier, demanding public accountability. They appeared at city council sessions, on local news, on social media. Their grief refused to stay quiet. The mistake no one wanted to admit deep inside the case file was a decision that couldn't be undone. In the early days, police had hesitated to release certain information to the public, details about the timing, the vehicles, the suspected angles of attack. They feared tipping off the shooters, but in doing so, they may have lost something more valuable. Momentum. By the time images were released, by the time appeals became urgent, the city had already begun to forget details. People moved on. Witnesses blurred. Fear settled in. Halle wondered if the killers had counted on that, if they knew time would protect them. A detective's breaking point late one night. Halle sat alone in his office, staring at the caseboard. Photos of victims, maps, timelines, unanswered questions. He noticed something he had overlooked before. The timing of the attack lined up perfectly with a shift change at a nearby patrol route. Fewer officers in the area. Slower response time. Coincidence? Or inside knowledge? The thought chilled him. If someone had fed information to the shooters, that meant the danger wasn't over, not just for the city, but for the truth itself. The clock keeps ticking by the 6th month. The case officially entered what police quietly call a long-term investigation. Not cold, but not close. The shooters were still out there. Unidentified, unpunished, unafraid, and the most painful reality settled in. Every day without answers made it easier for them to disappear forever. The case that refused to die. Hier passed. Stockton changed in small ways after the shooting, but the scar remained. The banquet hall on Lucille Avenue stayed closed for months. When it finally reopened under new ownership, the walls were repainted, the lights replaced, and the floor polished until it looked new again. But everyone in the neighborhood knew. No amount of paint could erase what happened there, where the case stands now. Officially, the Stockton birthday party shooting is still open and active. No arrests have been made. No suspects have been publicly named. No weapons have been recovered. The case file is thick now. Thousands of pages of reports, interviews, forensic analyses, and tips. It lives in both digital archives and a locked cabinet at the department, marked with a red label that reads simply, Unsolved. Investigators still receive tips from time to time. A memory triggered by a documentary. A guilty conscience stirred by a news anniversary. A rumor overheard at a bar. Most go nowhere. But police read every one. Because it only takes one crack. The questions that won't go away, some questions refuse to fade, no matter how much time passes. Why a child's birthday party? Who was the real target? How did the shooters know the exact timing? Why has no one talked? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how does a crime this public leave behind so little truth? Detective Marcus Halle still works the case, though it is no longer his only assignment. He keeps a copy of the victims' photos on his desk, not for motivation, but for accountability. They deserve answers, he says quietly, whenever asked why he hasn't let go. He believes someone knows more. Someone always does. The theory that still haunts investigators among all the theories, one remains particularly troubling, that the shooters were outsiders, brought in specifically to avoid recognition, paid in cash. Given information. 10 cent. Hawaii. If true, it explains the silence, the lack of rumors, the fear. It also means the people who planned the attack may still be living normal lives, watching from a distance, confident that time has buried their secret. But time has a habit of digging things back up. The families promise every year on the anniversary of the shooting. Families gather near the hall. They light candles. They say the names. They remind the city and the police that this story isn't over. Some parents have turned their grief into action, pushing for community programs, gun violence prevention, and better witness protection. Others simply want justice, no matter how long it takes. Their message is always the same. We haven't forgotten. Why this case still matters. Unsolved cases don't just belong to the past. They shape the future. They test whether a community believes in accountability or accepts fear as normal. They ask whether silence is stronger than truth. This case matters because it proves something painful. You don't need to disappear into darkness to get away with murder. Sometimes you just need time. The final truth, somewhere. Someone remembers a face, a voice, a car parked too close, a message sent too late. And someday tomorrow, next year, or 10 years from now, memory may surface. When it does, this case will no longer be a story about what was lost. It'll become a story about what was finally revealed. Until then, the city waits, and the file stays open.